Civil war ensues, and those who call upon the name of the Lord win against overwhelming odds, twice. Asa responds to prophecy by reaffirming Judah's commitment to God, and we continue our conversation about limiting our liberties in love. Today on 3-in-1, as we consider 2 Chronicles chapters 13 through 15 and Romans chapter 15. Abijah versus Jeroboam. 400,000 men with Abijah and 800,000 men with Jeroboam. And even after Abijah took a stand in faith, telling Jeroboam that they would win because Jeroboam had forsaken the law of the Lord, it still looked like, from all outward assessments, that they were going to lose, especially when Jeroboam had half of his military in front and then in ambush half of his military behind Abijah. Surrounded, Judah under Abijah refused to be confounded, and they called upon the name of the Lord. And then the priests sounded the trumpets, and then it says, the men of Judah gave a shout. And as the men of Judah shouted, it happened that God struck Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. And I like that. Several times in the scriptures there is a shout just before God shows up in power, and it must be a shout of faith. Just imagine the armies of Judah surrounded on all sides, outnumbered 2-1, but also knowing that they had prayed and praised privately, and so they would prevail publicly. And so they prayed again, and the priests sounded the trumpets, and the warriors of God gave a shout. Can't you just see their eyes? Full of faith, outnumbered by outward assessments, but not full of fear, ready to fight physically by faith. Well, as we read today, God honored their faith, and this battle too belonged to the Lord as he fought on their behalf. Now that was in chapter 13 with King Abijah, and something similar happened in chapter 14 with King Asa. This time they are outnumbered by more than just 2-1, as the armies of Ethiopia amass in battle array against Judah. 1,000,000 men this time, and 300 chariots. And Judah doesn't stand a chance unless this battle too belongs to the Lord. And so King Asa cries out to the Lord, as we read in verse 11. It says, "And Asa cried out to the Lord his God and said, 'Lord, it is nothing for you to help, whether with many or with those who have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rest on you, and in your name we go against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Do not let men prevail against you.'" Man, what a model. What a model for prayer when you're overwhelmed by the enemy. There's nothing too hard for the Lord, and he is obviously greater than any enemy we could ever face. But before we walk out onto that battlefield, before the enemy, we better make sure that the Lord is going out before us. Maybe saying something like this, "Lord, it is nothing for you to help, whether with many or with those who have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rest on you, and in your name we go against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Do not let man prevail against you." So great. And so God honored King Asa's cry, and this battle too belonged to the Lord. Now, it's one thing to cry out to God in the trying times, in the troubling times, and it's an entirely different thing to cry out to God in the mundane times. And let me ask you, which is more difficult, and which is more necessary? See, Asa is confronted with this fact in chapter 15, as Azariah delivers the word of the Lord to King Asa, saying, "Hear me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you, while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." And he went on to say, for a long time now, when Israel was in trouble, that's when they would turn to the Lord. But God didn't want to be just a warrior fighting their battles from time to time. Rather, he wanted to be their father in fellowship with them all the time. And so Asa instituted the institutional change that the nation needed so that learning the law and loving the Lord would become a normal part of everyday life in Judah. Now, we know that this is God's heart for us as well. God doesn't want to be just a warrior fighting our battles from time to time. Rather, he wants to be our Father in fellowship with us all the time, every day, all day. I am fond of saying to my little Willow, "Hey, Willow, guess what?" She goes, "What?" And I say, "I love you." She goes, "I know, all the days." I love that. I love you all the days. God wants to be our Father every day, all day, as we learn to walk in the law of love, laying down our lives so that others may live, limiting our liberties in love so that others may not be stumbled. Like what we read today in Romans chapter 15. As the conversation continues about limiting our liberties in love, starting with that intense first verse, "We then who are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves." Again, listen to that same verse from the New English Bible. "Those of us who have a robust conscience must accept as our own burden the tender scruples of weaker men and not consider ourselves." See, if we fight for our right to flaunt our liberties, we are not walking in the law of love. Jesus had every right to come into this world as the King of Kings with an amazing entourage of angels, and yet, how did he choose to come into the world? He chose to humble himself. He chose to come as a little helpless baby boy born to teenage broke parents, growing up in a town where people said nothing good could come out of that town. He limited his liberties in love for others' sake and for the sake of the gospel, and eventually he laid down his life in love so that others may live. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. That's what it says in 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. And then in John 15:13, it says, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." This is the law of love. We are not to fight for our rights or flaunt our liberties, but rather, following Christ's example, we are to limit our liberties and lay down our lives so that others may truly live. We then, who are strong, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, leading to edification. For even Christ did not please himself. Listen to those verses again from the New English Bible. Those of us who have a robust conscience must accept as our own burden the tender scruples of weaker men and not consider ourselves. Each of us must consider his neighbor and think what is for his good and will build up the common life. For Christ, too, did not consider himself.